4. The third son, Alyosha. He was only 20 years old then. His brother Ivan was in his 24th year, and their eldest brother, Dmitri, in his 28th. First of all, let me say that this young man, Alyosha, was not at all a fanatic, and at least, in my opinion, not even a mystic. Let me make myself absolutely clear from the very beginning. He was simply a precocious lover of humanity. And if he took up the monastic way of life, it was only because, at the time, it alone appealed powerfully to his imagination and showed him, as it were, the ideal way of an escape for his soul struggling to emerge from the darkness of worldly wickedness to the light of love. And this way of life appealed so strongly to him only because just then he had met, as he thought, an extraordinary being, Zosima, the famous elder in our monastery, to whom he grew attached with all the warmth of the first love of his unquenchably ardent heart. Still, I do not deny that he was very strange, even then, having been so, indeed, from his cradle. I have incidentally already mentioned the fact that, though only in his 4th year, when his mother died, he remembered her all his life, her face, her caresses, just as though she were standing alive before me. Such memories, as everyone knows, may be retained from an even earlier age, even from the age of 2, but merely appear all through life like shafts of light out of the darkness, like a tiny corner torn out of a huge picture, which has all faded and disappeared except for that tiny corner. So it was with him. All he remembered was an evening, a quiet summer evening, an open window, the slanting rays of the setting sun. It was the slanting rays that he remembered most of all. An icon in the corner of the room, a lighted lamp in front of it, and on her knees before the icon his mother, sobbing as though in hysterics, with screams and shrieks, snatching him up in her arms, hugging him to her breast so tightly that it hurt, and praying for him to the Virgin, holding him out in both arms to the icon as though under the Virgin's protection. And suddenly a nurse runs in and snatches him from her in terror. There you have the picture. At the moment, Alyosha remembered his mother's face, too. He used to say that as far as he could remember, it was frenzied but beautiful. But there were very few people indeed with whom he would share this memory. In his childhood and adolescence he was not effusive, and he did not even like to talk a great deal. But it was not from mistrustfulness, nor from shyness, or from morose unsociability. Quite the contrary. It was from something else, from a sort of inner preoccupation, a preoccupation that concerned only himself and had nothing to do with anyone else, but so important to him that he seemed to forget others because of it. But he loved people. All his life he seemed to have a complete faith in people, and yet no one ever took him for a simpleton or a naive person. There was something in him that told you, and indeed convinced you, and it was so all through his life afterwards, that he did not want to set himself up as a judge of people, and he would not like to assume the role of one who condemned, or in fact to condemn anyone or anything. It also seemed that he tolerated everything without in the least passing judgment, though often grieving bitterly. Indeed, he went so far as not to be surprised or frightened by anything anyone did, and that even as a child. Arriving at the age of 20 at his father's house, which was a vertical den of the filthiest vice, he, chaste and pure as he was, simply withdrew in silence when it was unbearable to look on, but without the slightest sign of contempt for or condemnation of anyone. His father, on the other hand, having been a sponger once and therefore a morbidly suspicious man who was quick to take offense, had met him at first mistrustfully and sullenly. He's much too silent and thinks too much, he thought, but finished up by constantly hugging and kissing him before a fortnight was out, with drunken tears, it is true, and with tipsy sentimentality, but it was evident that he had grown to love him sincerely and deeply, in a way no man like him could ever, of course, have been expected to love anyone. But then, everyone loved this young man, wherever he made an appearance, and that had been so from the earliest days of his childhood, when he entered the house of his benefactor and patron, Yefrem Polanov. Everyone in that household grew so attached to him that they treated him as one of the family. And yet he had entered that household at such a tender age that it was quite impossible to suspect the child of possessing any calculating duplicity or pushfulness or any skill in ingratiating himself into anyone's favor, or any knowledge of how to make oneself liked, so that his gift of arousing a special kind of love in people was, as it were, inherent in his very nature, artless and spontaneous. It was the same at school, and yet it would seem that he was one of those children who arouse the distrust of their schoolmates and are sometimes laughed at and even hated. He would, for instance, often fall into a reverie, and he seemed to shun the company of others. Even as a little boy, he liked to retire into some corner and read a book, and yet his schoolmates grew so fond of him that he could be described, without fear of contradiction, as a general favorite, all of the while he was at school. He was seldom playful or even merry, but one look at him was sufficient to make people realize that there was not a trace of moroseness in him, that, on the contrary, he was serene and even-tempered. He never attempted to show off before children of his own age. Perhaps that was why he was never afraid of anyone, and yet his schoolfellows at once realized that he was not at all proud of his fearlessness, but gave the impression of someone who had no idea that he was brave and fearless. He never bore a grudge against anyone. It often happened that an hour later he would reply to the boy who had offended him or speak to him with as trustful and serene an expression as though nothing had happened between them. And he did so without any indication that he had accidentally forgotten or deliberately forgiven the insult. It was simply that he did not think of it as an insult, and it was this that appealed so strongly to the children and made them like him. There was only one trait of his character which invariably aroused in all his schoolmates, from the lowest to the highest form, the desire to pull his leg, though not of malice, but because it amused them. This was his absurd and morbid modesty and chastity. He could not bear to hear certain words and certain conversations about women. These words and conversations are unhappily impossible to eradicate in schools. Boys who are pure in heart and soul, almost children, often like to talk in class in whispers and even aloud of things, pictures or images of which even soldiers would hesitate to speak. Moreover, soldiers do not know or understand a great deal of what is familiar to quite young children of our educated and higher classes of society. There is as yet no moral depravity, nor any real corrupt inner cynicism, but there is the appearance of it, and it is this kind of cynicism that they often consider as something refined, subtle, daring, and even worthy of imitation. Seeing that Alyosha Karamazov stopped his ears with his fingers every time they talked about that, they sometimes deliberately crowded around him, pulled his hands away from his ears by force, and shouted obscenities into both ears, while he struggled to free himself, lay down on the floor, tried to hide his face, and he did all this without uttering a word, without quarreling, bearing their taunts in silence. In the end, however, they left him alone, and no longer teased him for being a silly little girl. And not only that, but they were genuinely sorry for him because of it. Incidentally, he was always one of the best pupils in the class, but was never singled out as the top boy of the form. After Yefim Polanov's death, Alyosha spent another 2 years at the secondary school. Almost immediately after his death, the inconsolable widow went for a long visit to Italy with her whole household, consisting entirely of women. Alyosha went to live in the house of 2 ladies, distant relatives of Yefim Polonov, whom he had never seen before, and he did not know himself on what terms. Another very characteristic trait of his character was that he never cared at whose expense he was living. In that respect he was in complete contrast to his elder brother, Ivan, who had experienced extreme want during the first 2 years at the university and had had to earn his own living, and who from his earliest childhood had resented the fact that he was entirely dependent on the charity of his benefactor. But this strange trait in Alyosha's character could not apparently be too severely condemned, for anyone who had only the slightest acquaintance with him was immediately convinced, whenever this question arose, that Alyosha was one of those young men who in a way resembled saintly fools, and who, if they suddenly came into possession of a large sum of money, would not hesitate to give it away at the first demand, either to some charity or perhaps simply to the first clever swindler who happened to ask for it. And generally speaking, he did not seem to know the value of money, though not, of course, in a literal sense. When he was given pocket money, which he never asked for himself, he either kept it for weeks, not knowing what to do with it, or was so very careless with it that it was gone in no time. Peter Mayusov, who was very sensitive where money and bourgeois honesty were concerned, delivered himself of the following aphorism after he had got to know Alyosha better some years later. Here you have perhaps the only man in the world who, if he were left alone without a penny in a strange city of 1,000,000 inhabitants, would never die of exposure or hunger, because he would be instantly fed and given some job. And if not, he would find a job himself, and that would cost him no effort or humiliation, nor would he be a burden to his employees. But, on the contrary, they would probably consider it a pleasure. He did not finish his studies at school. A year before the end of his course, he suddenly told the ladies with whom he lived that he was going to his father about a certain matter which had just happened to enter his head. The ladies, who were very fond of him, were unwilling to let him go. The journey was not an expensive one, and the ladies refused to let him pawn his watch, a parting gift of his benefactor's family, before they went abroad, but provided him liberally with money and even with a new suit of clothes and linen. But he returned half of their money to them, declaring that he had made up his mind to travel third class. On arriving in our little town, he at first made no direct answer to his father's question why he had come before finishing his studies at school, but was, I am told, quite unusually pensive. Soon it was discovered that he was trying to find his mother's grave. He had even confessed himself at the beginning that that was really why he had come, but it is doubtful whether that was the only reason for his visit. It is more probable that he did not know himself, and could not possibly explain what it was exactly that seemed suddenly to rise up in his soul and draw him irresistibly towards a new, unknown, but inevitable path. His father could not show him where his second wife was buried, because he had never bothered to visit her grave after her coffin had been covered over with earth, and it had been so long ago that he had entirely forgotten where it was. A word about Karamazov. He had been living only a short time in our town before the arrival of his sons. 3 or 4 years after the death of his second wife, he had gone to the south of Russia, and finally turned up in Odessa, where he spent several years. At first, he made the acquaintance, in his own words, of a lot of dirty, low-down Jews, but ended up by being received not only by dirty but also by highly respectable Jews. It can be reliably assumed that it was during that period of his life that he had acquired a special knack for making money and amassing capital. He returned finally to our little town about 3 years before Alyosha's arrival. His former acquaintances found him terribly aged, though he was not by any means such an old man. He carried himself not so much with more dignity than before as with more arrogance. The former clown, for instance, showed an insolent predilection for making others appear as clowns. His behavior with women was not just indecent, as it had been, but somehow disgusting. Soon he opened many new public houses in the district. It was evident that he was worth, perhaps, 100,000 rubles, or only a very little less. Many people of our town and district were not slow to borrow money from him, on the best possible security, of course. Of late, he had somehow grown to look bloated. He seemed to have lost his balance and his self-control. He had grown rather inconsequential, beginning one thing and finishing another, letting his thoughts wander from one project to another, and was more and more often drunk. Had it not been for his servant, Grigory, who had also grown quite old by that time, and who sometimes looked after him almost like a nurse, Karamazov would perhaps not have escaped serious trouble. Alyosha's arrival seemed to have had a sobering effect on him, even from the moral point of view, as though something had awakened in this prematurely aged man that had long been smothered in his soul. "Do you know, my boy," he often used to say to Alyosha, looking intently at him, "that you're like her, the shrieker, I mean." That was what he called his dead wife, Alyosha's mother. It was Grigory who at last showed the shrieker's grave to Alyosha. He took him to our town cemetery, and in a remote corner of it showed him a cheap but decently kept grave with a cast-iron gravestone, which bore the inscription of the name, social position, age, and date of death of the deceased. Below were even engraved 4 lines of ancient verse, which is usually found on the middle-class tombs. Surprisingly, this tombstone turned out to have been put up by Grigory. It was he who had put it up on the grave of the poor shrieker at his own expense, after Karamazov, whom he had often annoyed by reminding him of the grave, had at last gone to Odessa, dismissing both the grave and all his memories. Alyosha did not show any particular emotion at his mother's grave. He merely listened to Grigory's sober and sensible account of the erection of the tombstone, stood there for some time with a bowed head, and walked away without uttering a word. Since then he had not visited the cemetery for perhaps the whole of the year. But this small episode had also had an effect on Karamazov, and a very original one too. He suddenly took 1,000 rubles to our monastery and ordered requiem masses for the soul of his wife, but not for the second, Alyosha's mother, the shrieker, but for the first, Adelaida, who used to beat him. In the evening of the same day he got drunk and abused the monks to Alyosha. He himself was far from religious. The man had probably never put a penny candle before an icon. Such individuals have a very strange outburst of sudden feelings and sudden thoughts. I have already mentioned that he had grown very bloated. By the time his face bore unmistakable traces of the sort of life he had led, In addition to the long fleshy bags under his little eyes, which were always insolent, suspicious, and sardonic, in addition to the multitude of deep wrinkles on his fat little face, there hung under his sharp chin a large Adam's apple, fleshy and longish, like a little purse, which gave him a sort of revoltingly sensual appearance. Add to that a long, cruel, and sensual mouth with full lips, between which could be seen stumps of black and almost decayed teeth. He sputtered every time he began to speak. However, he liked to make fun of his own face himself, though he was apparently well satisfied with it. He used particularly to point to his nose, which was not very large, but very thin and conspicuously aquiline. A regular Roman nose, he used to say, and together with my Adam's apple, a real face of an ancient Roman patrician of the decadent period. He seemed proud of it. It was shortly after finding his mother's grave that Alyosha suddenly told his father that he wanted to enter the monastery and that the monks were willing to receive him as a novice. He explained that it was his fervent wish, and that he was asking his solemn consent as his father. The old man already knew that the elder Zosima, who was seeking salvation in the hermitage of our monastery, had made a special impression on his gentle boy. That elder, he said, had listened to Alyosha thoughtfully and in silence, and not in the least surprised at his request. It is, of course, one of their most honest monks. So that's where you want to be, my gentle boy. He was half drunk, and suddenly smiled his slow, half-tipsy smile, which was not without cunning and drunken craftiness. Well, you know, my boy, I had a feeling you'd finish up by doing something like that. You believe me, don't you? That's what you always intended to do, isn't it? I'm sure of that. Well, why not? You've got your own 2,000. There's your dowry, and I'll never leave you in the lurch, my boy. Why, I'll pay what's necessary for you there, if they ask me for it. And if they don't ask, why go begging them to accept my money? Isn't that so? Why, you spend money like a canary, 2 grains a week. There's a certain monastery, you know, with a cluster of houses at the bottom of the hill, in which, as everyone knows, the monastery wives, as they are called, live. Thirsty wives in all, I should think. I've been there. And you know, it's interesting in its own way, of course. I mean, just to relieve the monastery, you understand. The only awful thing about it is the terrible Russian patriotism of these fellows. Not a single Frenchwoman among them, and they could have had them, for they have pots of money. I suppose when they get to hear of it, they'll be coming along. Well, here there's nothing of the kind. No monastery wives, just 200 monks. Everything above board. They keep their fasts. True enough. So you want to go to the monks, do you? You know, I really am sorry for you, Alyosha. You may not believe it, my boy, but I've grown very fond of you. Still, I suppose it's all for the best. You'll pray for us sinners, and we are, for we have sinned quite a lot here, haven't we? I've always wondered who would ever pray for me. Does such a man exist in the world, my dear boy? I'm awfully stupid about such things. You do believe me, don't you? Awfully. You see, stupid as I am about these things, I keep thinking, not very often, of course, but I do all the same. Why, I say to myself, the devils will surely not forget to drag me down with hooks to their place when I die. Well, then, so I think to myself, hooks. Where do they get their hooks from? What are they made of? Iron? Where do they forge them? They get some sort of workshop there. Have they? You see, in your monastery, the monks are quite certain that, for instance, there's a ceiling in hell. Now, I'm quite willing to believe in hell, but only if it has no ceiling. It makes it much more refined, more enlightened, more Lutheran-like, that is. But actually, it doesn't make much difference whether hell has a ceiling or not, does it now? And yet the whole damn business depends on that alone. For if there is no ceiling, there can be no hooks, and if there's no hooks, the whole thing's a fake, which again is unlikely, for who would then drag me down with hooks? And if they don't drag me down, what's going to happen then? Where's justice in the world? Il faudrait les inventer. The hooks, I mean, just for me alone. For if you only knew, Alyosha, what a shameless wretch I am. But there are no hooks there, said Alyosha, gazing gently and seriously at his father. I see, I see, only shadows of hooks. I know. This is how a Frenchman describes hell. J'ai vu l'ombre d'un cocker qui avec l'ombre d'un brosse frottait l'ombre d'un carrosse. But how do you know there are no hooks, my boy? When you've been with the monks, you'll sing another time. However, go by all means, get at the truth there, and come and tell me. I dare say it will be easier going to the other world if you know for certain what it's like there. Besides, it is more seemly for you to live with the monks than here with a drunken old man and those young sluts. Though, like an angel, nothing can touch you. Well, perhaps nothing will touch you there either. You see, that's why I'm letting you go. That's what I hope for. You've got your head screwed on the right way. You're enthusiastic now, but you'll get over it. You'll be cured and come back to me, and I'll be waiting for you. For, you see, my dear boy, I feel that you're the only man in the world who hasn't condemned me. I feel it, you know. I can't help feeling it. And he even began to blubber. He was sentimental. He was wicked and sentimental.